Hello, Namaste, Adab, Sat Sri Akal, Vanakkam. A very warm welcome to every one of you who has joined today for an exploration of desire through the lanes and dargahs of Delhi. I am Anudeep Kannaganti, your moderator for today's session. And joining us today is our distinguished speaker, Professor Madhavi Menon, who will be leading today's discussion. Professor Madhavi Menon is a professor of English and the director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. She works at the intersection of identity, desire, politics, and literature. Her latest book, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, puts into conversation the major ideas of queer theory with the history of ideas in India. Professor Menon has graciously agreed to support us in our efforts to raise funds for the activities of Sangh. As many of you know, Sangh is a youth-led initiative working to support those who are affected by crises across India. All funds that are raised today will go towards rehabilitation of the victims of domestic abuse and relief work towards the floods in Bihar. I encourage you all to donate generously to the cause. And before I hand over the stage to Professor Menon, I would like to quickly go through the format for today's session. Professor Menon will speak for about 25 minutes. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session where I will read out the questions that you guys have asked in the comment section of the live window. So without much further ado, I welcome to my absolute favorite professor from Ashoka University, Professor Madhavi Menon. Ma'am, it's all yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Anudeep. Thank you to Sangh for having invited me. I'm so proud of what you're doing. I'm so proud of the energy and commitment and integrity that you've all displayed in spades. And so I'm very proud to be associated with Sangh and happy to be doing this session. Unfortunately, we started a little bit late, so I'll try and keep my remarks as brief as possible so we have maximum time for Q&A, because really this is about conversations. Everything, especially in a crisis situation, has to be about conversations, because the minute voices dry up, the minute conversations end, the minute dialogue ends, that's when you know you're in real trouble. So I want to begin today's session, and I'm just going to share my screen so that we can have, get this all ready to roll out. Today's session, which is titled fairly generically, A History of Desire in India, and as you must have seen on the poster, it asks how we might be able to reconceptualize desire in India and in relation to Delhi in specific and dargahs within Delhi. And so I want to begin by talking about some of the ideas that we associate with desire as being something that without which we cannot think about desire in our current context. Think about alternative versions about how we might think about desire without recourse to these concepts that I'm going to spell out. And then think about how the dargahs of Delhi, and indeed dargahs around India, bring together these alternative ideas about desire, these alternative histories of desire, to allow us to think about other ways of being. Because of course, one of the things that we are in danger right now is of forgetting alternatives and thinking that there's only one path that we must follow. So I want to begin then by thinking about three ways in which we almost always think about desire. And this doesn't seem to be moving, so I might just sort of start sharing it again. The three major concepts I'm going to suggest that we keep in mind when we think about desire. And the first one that I'm going to begin with seems so intuitive, seems so second nature to us that we couldn't even assume anything without it. And that is the question of the body. Now, I'm going to try and suggest that even though the body is such a central figure for us as we think about desire today, that there are in fact rich and deep histories in India in which the body is not the vehicle or the conduit through which desire takes shape. And so just to sort of begin with a couple of small examples and then to move on, in sort of classical Hindu texts or Vedic texts, what later came to be called Hindu, the story abounds in multiple versions of Kama, the god of desire, the god of love, the counterpart here to many different gods around the world who are also gods of love, is dispatched by the gods to try and wake up Shiva from his meditation, fall in love with Parvati, and they can have a child with which to kill the demon who is plaguing the gods. And the gods, as we all know, the gods of the Hindu pantheon, really of any pantheon, are great fun because they're always up to tricks and mischief and always plotting and planning things. And so Kama is dispatched to wake up Shiva from his meditation, sort of shoots his bow and arrow at him, as you can see from the image in front of you. Shiva wakes up and is so angry at having been disturbed in his meditation that he burns Kama to cinders and kills him. Then Parvati gets very upset and says, please, please, please restore him, bring him back to life. And so Shiva says, okay, I'll bring him back to life, but I will not restore his body. And so famously then, ever since this myth was first in circulation, Kama, the god of desire, is a god without a body. And this seems to suggest to us, especially at this moment when we're so invested in bodies, that in fact there are other ways to thinking about desire than rooting it through a body. Or another way of thinking about that is that there are other venues and avenues in which desire manifests itself, which are not always restricted to the body. So the body becomes one vehicle for it, but there are lots of other avenues in which and through which desire plays out. And so that's one thing I want to think about what might it mean to say that desire is not tethered to the body. One of the things that I'm going to come back to in much more detail, of course, is that this becomes a rich tradition among the Sufi poets as well in India. And when I say India, of course, I mean the broader Indian region, or the sort of Indic subcontinent. Because with Sufi poetry, as many of you will know, and we'll look at a little bit of Sufi poetry later on, as many of you will know, Sufi poetry tends to be addressed both to the very real carnal body of the physical earthly lover and to the disembodied version of a heavenly celestial god. And this sort of, the address takes place at both these levels simultaneously. So you're at one and the same time addressing your lover and addressing God. And so the body of either your lover or the god actually become very, very temporary and rather inconsequential, because you're constantly moving beyond the body. And this is an idea to which I'll come back, but just sort of briefly to say that the body that we're so obsessed with today, as you know, what is the truth of my body? What is my body's sexuality? What is my body's gender? There's actually a sort of another deep vein, historically, culturally, philosophically, religiously, literarily, that allow us to think about desire not as being grounded in the body. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of a name, which is to say the idea that desire has to have a name, that we have to know what to call our desire, that we have to know exactly what it is that I'm feeling, and this is the name by which it is known, and I'll announce myself as being described by that name. And which is, we're so obsessed with the name these days that we have an ever-increasing variety and number of names proliferating with each passing day. But the tale that I want to touch on very briefly, the tale of a god, a sort of Deccan, below the Deccan Dravidian god called Ayyappan, and who is apparently picturized in the image in front of you. And it's a long story, and I won't go into much detail about it. I've written about it in A History of Desire in India, for those of you who'd like to go read it. But very briefly, how this ties in with the idea of a name is that Ayyappan apparently ascends to the heaven. Ayyappan, as we know, is the son of two men. He's the son of Shiva and Vishnu. And because he's the son of two of the gods, two of the kings of the gods, he quickly rises to a very high position in the heavens. And he comes up with a plan, and his grand plan that he spends all his time trying to implement is that he wants to abolish both birth and death. Because of course, you know, if you don't have death, you won't need birth. And so he says, why don't we just save people a lot of misery and abolish both birth and death? Now, the other gods get very frustrated and upset with this, because of course, most of their revenues come in because either people want to induce a birth or they want to ward off death. And so they said, oh my God, if Ayyappan banishes and abolishes both birth and death, what are we going to do? So let's try and distract his attention. So they send Narada up to him to try and distract him. So Narada goes to Ayyappan and says, Ayyappan, can I have a word with you? And Ayyappan says, not now, Narada, I'm really busy. And, I have to do this thing about getting rid of birth and death. And Narada said, no, please, really, it'll just take 2 minutes of your time. So Ayyappan says, okay, he wants to be polite. What is it? So Narada says, I have a question that's really been troubling me, and I wonder if you can help me with it. So Ayyappan said, okay, what? He said, what name do you call your father's wife and your mother's wife? And remember, his father is Shiva, so Shiva's consort is Parvati, and his mother is Vishnu, and Vishnu's consort is Mohini. And so Ayyappan starts thinking about it. What is the name? Now, if maybe at a pinch, my father's consort can be my stepmother, even though they're not really married, because marriage was not really a thing. So, okay, but maybe I can call it that. But what about Mohini? What about Vishnu's consort? Because Vishnu is both my mother, but also a man and a mother with a wife, with a female consort, but also again not married. So what is the name I call Mohini? And legend has it that he's so deep in thought about this idea of a name, a question that he can never answer, that he comes back down to earth and sits in his temple in Shabrimala, which is why Shabrimala is considered so sacred. And so this idea of a name, requiring a name to describe relationships of desire, relationships of love, relationships of sexuality, really is not a concept that we always encounter when we think deeply about Indic histories. And the third idea I want to talk about, and I want to bring all these three ideas together, as I told you, in relation to dargahs, the third idea I want to talk about is the idea of categorizing desire, which is to say, and this is closely tied, of course, to the idea of a name, which in turn is closely tied to the idea of a body. This is the name of my desire. This is the body that inhabits that desire. This is the category that that desire fits into. And this is just an image from Khajuraho, the temples at Khajuraho, 11th century, as many of you know. And I always like to joke that several desiring configurations that were perfectly legible and legal and acceptable in ancient India are almost all illegal in India today. And so these ideas of, how do you categorize these desiring poses, two women having sex, but also having sex with a man, animals being involved, two men fondling each other, how do you characterize this? How do you categorize it? And again, one of the sort of surprising responses we get is that these kinds of categorizations don't really work. They don't really exist. And if and when they do exist, for instance, a little bit in the Kama Sutra, they exist only as an indicator that categorization does not work. So if we think in terms of bodies, names, and categories, the holy trinity, if you will, of how we organize desire today, we find that a history of desire in India suggests that these organizational categories don't actually work. And I want to illustrate that problematic, illustrate that interesting twist in the tale with reference to one of the great dargahs in Delhi, the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali. And for those of you listening in who are from Delhi and haven't seen it yet, please go to the Mehrauli Archaeological Complex. Those of you who are not in Delhi, please come to Delhi as soon as you can and go to Jamali Kamali's tomb because it's beautiful. One slight problem, of course, is that it is under lock and key, so it's actually inaccessible. And so the photo of the interior on the right-hand side that you're seeing is really a stock photograph that I was able to see through the jali work, but the actual front door is locked. Now, the reason I'm fascinated by the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali is that, like so many other dargahs, it puts pressure on these three seemingly fundamental structures of desire that I've just been talking about, on the idea of bodies, names, and categories. Now, this is a 16th century dargah or mausoleum in which a Sufi saint is buried. 16th century dargah from Delhi. And we know it's a dargah because there's a space on the left-hand side, you can see immediately in front of the darwaza of the dargah for Qawwali singers, or what was called a sama, and what is called a sama, to gather, presumably every Friday evening, but perhaps even every evening of the week. And so Jamali was a Sufi saint, Sheikh Fazlullah, who sort of lived through multiple rulers in Delhi, was a very renowned, very respected saint. He dies in the 16th century and is buried there. But the mystery is about who Kamali is. What is the identity of Kamali? Who was he? Why was he buried next to Jamali? What is his relationship to Jamali? What is the name of that relationship? How do we categorize it? And the reason I'm fascinated with Jamali Kamali is because it instantiates, it exemplifies a phenomenon that I've been calling Dargah desire, because it really resists our current modes in which we categorize desire. And so Jamali is a male Sufi saint buried there. And we know for a fact that Kamali too is a man, because with these Sufi graves, the graves of the men and women look different. So the male graves had little pen boxes on top of them, little structures that look like pen cases, pencil cases, because that denotes the writing implements with which the Sufi saints write. Whereas women saints' graves have a flat surface to denote the paper on which that writing is done. And so both the graves inside the Dargah of Jamali Kamali belong to men. So we know there are two men buried side by side. And this burial side by side very much plays into a trope that Bollywood still plays with, which is this idea of Janam Janam Ka Saath. Together, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. If you're buried together, you're going to belong together forever. So it's a very clearly romantic trope, a trope of an intense bond, even if we don't want to call it romantic. No one knows who Kamali was. We know it's a man. He could have been a disciple of Jamali's. He could have been a Jamali's lover. He could have been a student. He could have been all those three things. We don't know when he was given his rhyming name, whether the rhyming name itself was a token of their love for one another. But what we do know is that Kamali's relationship to Jamali was so highly regarded and respected that he was buried next to his peer, next to his teacher, next to his saint after Jamali's death. And so it was recognized by everyone around them as being an affectively intense relationship. So that's one thing, right? So this is an affective bond that doesn't really have a name, and an affective bond between two men. What also fascinates me about the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali is its architectural androgyny, if you will. Because as you will see in the image on the left, the Dargah has a flat roof. And as you can tell somewhat from the image on the right, that the interior is actually a domed ceiling, a domed vaulted ceiling. So what's interesting to me about this building architecturally is that, and remember I just finished telling you that women's graves have the flat stone on top. So it's female on the outside and the male graves have this vaulted pencil box, and it is a male dome on the inside. And so what's interesting or fascinating to me about the structure is that the structure itself, that's housing a desire that resists and refuses being named and categorized with any certainty, the structure itself is androgynous and refuses naming and categorization with any certainty. So it's really fascinating to me to see the many layers and levels on which the complexity of desire plays out in the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali. Now, just to sort of give you a couple of examples of Sufi poetry in which this kind of sort of intensity, this affective intensity that defies naming, that defies anchoring, that defies categorization comes to us. Just a couple of examples from Bulle Shah, which I will leave for you to read, where Bulle Shah speaks of himself as a woman in relation to his peer Shah Inayat, who is a man. He talks about himself as a woman, but the pronoun that he continues to use for himself is the masculine pronoun. And so again, this always existing masculine femininity, the androgyny of Sufi poetry is just something that is taken for granted and is described in sort of passionate, sensual detail, as you can see with Bulle Shah's poetry. One of the more famous examples of this, of course, will be Amir Khusro's famous ghazal for Nizamuddin Chishti, where he says, Chhap tilak sab chhine mo se naina milai ke. You have taken away all my signs of modesty just by locking eyes with me. And again, this trope of locking eyes, being buried together, dancing, being dressed in bridal clothing, bridal finery, all these tropes become tropes addressed by one man to another without specifying what that relationship is. And as you will see with the second quote I have from Bulleh Shah, and I wish we could spend more time on it, but as you'll see with the second quote from Bulleh Shah, he talks about at once being both Heer and Ranjha, being both male and female, occupying both positions. And he says wonderfully, the minute people realize that these in fact are not two positions, that they're certainly not a binary, that they're certainly not opposites, the minute you realize that, all disputes will be over, all tensions will be over, all stresses will be over. And I think that's a sort of beautiful and fascinating account of what it means to actually think about a world in which these kinds of conflicts, in fact, the kinds of conflicts that Sangh is addressing so beautifully, actually get to take on a different kind of meaning, far less sinister, far more pleasurable, and far more steeped in a milieu that is more tolerant. And Sufi poetry gives us that kind of tolerance in spades. And so to go back to the image I heard earlier about Sufi poets, the love that they talk about is not, as I have said, a love that dare not speak its name. And that quote, a love that dare not speak its name, is of course a Western name for specifically male homosexuality, where for centuries, of course, you could not name homosexuality, which is why it was called a love that dare not speak its name, which is different from the way the Sufis do not spell out a name. It's not that they do not dare to speak its name. They know that every time they say a name, there is also another name and another name and another name that can be added on to it. And so with Sufi poetry, in the sort of culture spawned by Dargah desire, you see a multiplicity of names rather than a paucity of it. You see many levels and layers of engagement of desire rather than a shutting down of desire altogether. And this opening up, this expansiveness, this multiplicity is very much what I was trying to talk about from the beginning onwards, about the alternative histories. The alternative histories, not only in dargahs, not only in Delhi, but really all across the Indic subcontinent, where we've had multiple desires and syncretic narratives, right? Syncretic narratives bringing together religions, bringing together communities, bringing together desires that have now or are now in the process of being rudely torn apart. And one of the things that I'm very deeply invested politically in doing is reminding ourselves of this multiplicity, especially at this political moment. And so I'll end just with a couple of things. One, and I won't dwell on this because we don't really have much time, is to say that these were the kinds of desires that the British colonialists encountered when they came to India. And they were so horrified by it on multiple levels, across religions, across regions, that they did their best to actually censor them, to shut them down, to criminalize them. And that's a whole sort of different set of narratives that we can go into. But what I've given you on this slide is just a couple of examples of the kinds of multiplicity, the kinds of wildness that the British was so horrified by. And I want to end then by thinking again, and this is an image, this is one of my favorite images. It's an image of the mosque that's attached to the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali. You can see the Wazunama in the front, the sort of well-like structure where the devotees wash themselves, clean themselves before going into the masjid. And the Dargah of Jamali and Kamali is right there on the right-hand side. You have to enter through a wall. And the reason I love this image, the reason I love that entire structure is because it speaks to a time of plurality. It speaks to a time when the idea of desires very much crossed the straitjackets of bodies and names and categories in which we find ourselves right now. And thinking about these desires as being non-rigid, thinking about them as being syncretic, as being inclusive, as being multiple, really allows us to ponder the richness and the depth of what has been for centuries a history of desire in India, and what is currently the very thing that we run the risk of actually losing. So I'm going to stop there for now, but only because, of course, I want to hear other voices and other questions, and I welcome all your questions about anything I've said or anything that gave rise to. So thank you, and Anudeep, back to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was great to look at the history of desire in India and see how it is it rebels against being categorized and sort of being put in a box. We have a lot of questions coming in. I will start off with one question here. I have observed in everyday life that sometimes when women try to own their sexuality, they come off as if they are performing for the male gaze, perhaps because sexuality is seen in a heterosexual context. Is there a way to express our sexuality without intentionally, unintentionally performing for men?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's a question that can't necessarily be answered fully or with finality. But let me suggest a couple of things to think about in relation to this question without sort of giving you a how-to kit or anything of the kind. You see, the trouble with heterosexuality, God, that's a great phrase, isn't it? Because that is a never-ending topic. But the trouble with heterosexuality is that its rules, for lack of a better word, its structures have become so deeply ingrained that one can never tell if one is ever going to be able to step outside it. There's, of course, been a lot of work already done on, for instance, how even if you are not heterosexual, even if you think of yourself as homosexual, you tend to structure your relationships very much according to paradigms that have been presented to us by heterosexuality. So the answer of can we ever get outside a certain kind of dominant structure is a very tricky question. Because it would mean that we all know where the limits of that structure are, that even if we wanted to step outside it, if such a thing were even possible, that equally other people would be able to step outside it when we step outside it and would be able to see us the same way. And of course, there is no guarantee of any of that. So I think one of the things we have to accept, difficult though it might be, is that women might always be seen as performing heterosexually for men, that there might never be a way outside that. The only way in which we can still continue to be sexually agential people, despite running the risk of being read in that way, is that we don't care about how we are read. That we don't necessarily care about people labeling us in a particular way as performing, as sort of, behaving because of X reason or Y reason, as performing in ways that are not genuine. Because once we start thinking about intentionality, that's a slippery slope. And so we shouldn't care about what other people think about our intentions. And equally, we should not be bothered, or we should realize that we cannot actually tell what other people's intentions might be. So difficult though it is, I think we have to be able to arrive at a degree of comfort, no matter what, with thinking about our own sexual positions. If we want to be sexually expressive and we want to be understood in the right way, and we want everyone to think well of us, that might be asking for a bit too much. My suggestion is let's at least start with the first step, which is let's at least start with expressing ourselves sexually. And then let's see what happens, and we'll see down the line where we go and what happens.
Thank you, Professor. The next one is closely related to what we just discussed. Commenter asks, what do you think of the intersection of heterosexual desire and violence?
And violence?
Yes.
What do I think about it? I think it's a very bad thing. I mean, what do I say? It's just, it's one of those unended for everyone involved. So heterosexuality in many ways is a disease, if you want to use the current terminology, a virus, if you will, that infects everybody involved in its ambit. And so heterosexuality is very much an outcrop, as we know, of a certain kind of patriarchal investment. And when I talk about a patriarchal investment, I don't mean I don't mean a structure in which men are evil and women are good. When I talk about a patriarchal structure, I mean a structure in which men are expected to be superior to women. And both men and women have to accept that division between superior and inferior. Because as we know, patriarchal assumptions and patriarchal rules are upheld as much, if not with more violence, by women than they are by men. And that's such a heartbreaking and sad reality of the position we're in today. And I say it's sad for all involved because I don't think it's particularly easy for men to always be able to occupy and live up to this pedestal on which they are automatically placed. To always be the people who are earning well, always be the people who are looking after everyone around them, always being the people who are supposed to be emotionally strong and who are supposed to be top dogs. I think it's actually extremely difficult. No, actually, I need to say impossible to occupy that position. But when one has been put in that position by centuries of patriarchy, there is a certain kind of emotional stunting that comes along with that position. Because you feel like, or you are made to feel like a failure if you don't occupy that position. And we all know, as psychoanalysis, psychology, sociology, anthropology, all these subjects have taught us that violence is most closely related to a sense of failure. That it is when you feel like you are a failure that you most are liable and likely to inflict violence on others and yourself. You inflict violence on others as a way of downplaying the pain that you're feeling, right? If I make someone else feel pain, that will take away my pain, which of course never happens, but that is the way you think. Or because I am in such pain, I have to find somebody who is weaker than I am so that I don't feel so weak. And so this kind of, so I wouldn't even call it heterosexuality, even though heterosexuality is a manifestation of it. I would call it patriarchy. I'd call it what it is. And so the automatic outcome of this kind of patriarchal structure in which women are told to be weak and men are told to be strong results in weakness all around, results in us not recognizing strong women, results in us resenting strong women, which ties back to the first question, and results in us fetishizing men's strength, even and especially when they don't have it. Whether in terms of caste or class or religion or physical ability or economic power or social mobility. And when men feel weak, despite being told always that you are meant to be strong, that's when violence breaks loose. That's when this kind of abuse that we see rampant in the world takes shape. And that is just a horrific fact that we've been living with.
Yes, Professor. And it's interesting. I remembered something that I think Jimmy Kimmel says about American masculinity. He says that American masculinity is animated by the threat of the other man. So I think what you said about violence being rooted in failure, a sense of failure, I think
Yeah.
that relates to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next, we have a couple of questions related to Jamali Kamali, where one commenter asks if that is a way to look at architecture queerly, and related to that, how to overcome dangerous policing when we as queer people reclaim various spaces by reading it as queerly. For example, architecture in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me sort of address the second question first, even though, of course, they're both related. Claiming space is one of the big battles we have on our hands today. And it's a battle that we have to fight, especially because at this socio-political moment, with the coronavirus raging, what we have been told over and over again is that public spaces are dangerous. That in fact, being out in public is a recipe for fatality. And this is why, of course, especially in this country, which is heartbreaking, we're not seeing any protests, we're not seeing any public gatherings, we're not seeing any kind of mass movement, because the idea of a movement in public has already been demonized to a great extent. So what it means to claim a public space is particularly fraught at this moment in time, which means, of course, this is the right moment to think about it and to think about the politics of what that means to claim a public space. Now, public spaces have always been spaces of danger. There have always been spaces of danger, especially in the last 200 or 300 years, with a certain kind of colonial mindset, because there is a sense of sex is something that must and should happen in private. And so the public space is always denoted as a non-sexual and therefore, of course, heteronormative space in which you can be fully clothed and asexual. Now, this is something that is experientially not true. A lot of queer people have sex in public and have historically done so, mostly because there is no space for them in private to do it. And also because there's a certain kind of rebelliousness in saying, I'm going to claim this space for my pleasure, because this is public space and it's shared space. Now, and that is something I believe we have to do. But there are many, many factors working against us. Not only, as I said, this sort of fatality associated with the public space right now, but even if you look at a wonderful judgment like the 377 judgment in 2018, which decriminalized, read down 377, decriminalized consensual same-sex relationships in India, even that judgment is premised on the idea that it decriminalizes same-sex relationships in private. And so even laws that are helpful, even laws that are extremely welcome, have erred on the side of saying private space is where sex belongs. And so to think about the public space as a queer space, whether you are thinking about a dargah, an architectural marvel queerly, or whether you're having sex behind a tree or behind a bush or near the metro, all these fronts, I think we have to find a way of opening up again, because we have a lot of pressure and a lot of pushback to say sex should be kept in private behind closed doors, completely ignoring the experiential reality that many, many millions of people in India do not in fact have doors to close. And even if they do, they're sharing those closed doors with 10 other people. And so the notion of privacy simply does not exist.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Then, a question asks, as an agnostic, it seems that all religion is universally directed in keeping the heteronormative social structure. Is there enough alternate evidence to direct religion to another direction where these structures can be dismantled?
It's, I'm not a scholar of religion. I'm deeply skeptical of all religions, but it is actually not true that all religions subscribe to and have always subscribed to a heteronormative marital structure. And that is one of the things I wanted to think about by talking about Jamali Kamali and the Sufis. Because even in Vedic religions, even in Vedic texts, marriage is actually a much, much later invention. It's not until the Mahabharata that you actually see the idea of marriage coming in. Before that, and certainly after that too, but still definitely before that, you have many, many kinds of queer couplings. You have many kinds of queer desires playing out, whether it's Vishnu and Shiva coming together to produce Ayyappan, whether it is Bulle Shah later on singing to Shah and Ayat. Religion and non-heteronormative desire actually have always walked hand in hand with each other. If we are told today, which we are, that religion is always and only heteronormative, that in fact is factually untrue. And we need to be able to read more and know more in order to make that argument back to the people who are trying to push this down our throat. Certainly, there are ways in which Christianity or biblical Christianity could be said to have elevated the idea of the monogamous heterosexual couple who have sex only for reproduction. But certainly no other religion in the world, whether they're monotheistic or not, has been so closely associated with that idea. And I think those are the strands of those religions that we need to be able to excavate.
Next question. How do you understand the possibilities of homo populist appropriation of Indic, especially Hindu sexual subcultures, by certain right-wing queer groups to legitimize a conservative notion of queerness, which refuses to converse with queerness as a mobile and inessential form of experience?
Yeah. You see, this is the real danger of the moment we're living in right now, which is that anything I say, the opposite to becomes true. And so these sort of right-wing queer groups that you're talking about, luckily, I don't know any of them or don't know any of people who belong to them, but I do know they exist. These right-wing queer groups you're talking about could well use every one of the same examples that I have mentioned in my presentation and use it to derive conclusions or derive ends that are very, very different from what I would like us to think about. And that is a real risk and a danger that we run. I think one way to address this problem, and certainly this was one of the ways that I tried to address it when I was thinking about my book, because as you remember, the title of my book and the title of today's session actually is A History of Desire in India. And I think if we claim not to be definitive, if we claim not to be writing the history of desire in India, if we claim to be unraveling one strand among multiple strands, then we are really inhabiting the space of queerness. Because queerness can never be anchored in the idea of absolute definition. So if you have recourse to classical Indian texts or classical Indian religions with a move to saying that this is the definitive history of India, that's when we need to be skeptical and suspicious, because that's when you know that the political agenda is much more conservative and right-wing than these histories actually allow us to be. The minute you move from the definite article the to the indefinite article like you're allowing space, as I said at the very beginning of today's session, for multiple voices. You're allowing space for dialogues. You're allowing people to come and say their piece, to say what they want and to engage with it. And that becomes the framework within which you can allow for syncretic conversations, in which sort of religions and castes and cultures and sexualities don't become rigid things, but become much more, to use your word, mobile categories.
Thank you, Professor. We'll have two more questions and then we'll close out the session. A question says, I was wondering if you could talk more about dargahs and desire. Is it common for people to be buried together, or was Jamali Kamali one of the exceptions?
No, in fact, it's much, much more the rule than the exception. The other people I've mentioned, Khusro and Nizamuddin, buried very near each other. Bulle Shah and Shah Inayat, multiple Sufi couples, as you can call them, all over India and Pakistan. I don't know about Bangladesh, but I'm sure it's true there too, but certainly in India and Pakistan. In fact, a very famous dargah in Lahore, the dargah of Madho Lal Hussain, Madho Lal and Shah Hussain. Madho Lal was so in love with Shah Hussain that he changed his name to Madho Lal Hussain. And that shrine has actually become a sort of queer cruising spot of sorts. And all these dargahs have two men buried side by side. So this is a very sort of deep tradition. It's a deeply ingrained tradition. And it's a tradition that didn't seem to bother people. That's what always fascinates me. That in fact, even as late as the early 20th century, we have officials of Punjab writing about Madho Lal Hussein's dargah and talking about how it's Urs, the annual festival of the saint buried there, is celebrated each year, and lots of people from different communities come to celebrate it. And he talks about how Shah Hussain was a lower caste convert to Islam from Hinduism. Madhaulal was an upper caste Brahmin. Two men who saw each other and completely fell in love without any hint of judgment. And this is an actual official of the British Empire, an Indian official from the Punjab. So that's what gives me pause, that we've had centuries of these kinds of histories without the kind of violence, without the kind of disapproval and disapprobation. And even if disapproval and disapprobation existed, it was never enough to lynch people or to tear down structures or to destroy masjids or anything of the kind. And so at some moments, that our current dispensation takes my breath away, because how did we ever get here? Because we have such long, rich, deep traditions of the opposite of this kind of behavior. And which is why I think we need to talk more about them, to get in touch with them a lot more, talk about them to multiple people, so that we can remind ourselves that we are better than who we are today.
The last question, I think it's something that a lot of queer people struggle with. It asks, how do we reconcile familial desires and responsibilities with our personal queerness and queer lives? Considering a suffocating rigidity and toxic passivity in denying personal, familial, and financial freedoms by many closeted, conservative, patriarchal family systems.
Yeah. And again, this is a good question. Again, what always amazes me, I guess both things, is that we all of us, and I'm making this generalization quite knowingly because I haven't met an exception to the rule as yet. We all have families in which there is an uncle or an aunt or a third cousin or whatever who's unmarried, who, if he is an uncle, has a very close male friend, who often goes on holidays with them, who brought up together or been together since college days, often share a house or meet each other every day, and we don't think twice about it. We just say that's the way it is. Or there is an aunt who is unmarried and sort of looks after multiple things, has intense relationships with other women, and we don't think twice about it. So one of the things I would like to say as a prelude to responding to this very important question is that there have always been queer people in our family spaces. And we have not always called them queer, which has certain advantages, which goes back to the idea of naming and not naming that I was talking about earlier. So having queer people in heterosexual familial spaces is not a new thing. We have all grown up with it. And so that's one of the things I think to remind our conservative family members about. The second thing I would say is, and that this actually, it's a nice symmetry because it goes back to the very first question with which we started, which is, at a certain level or beyond a certain point, if you can afford it financially, you should not give a damn about what your family says. Many, many, many people can't afford it financially. They cannot, in fact, afford to cut their family out. And that is a much trickier situation. But if you can afford it, then you have to be able to act on your desires as you would like without necessarily feeling confined or constrained. Also, remember though, that this is not a problem that is unique to queer people alone. It is common to anybody and everybody in the Indian context who wants to break some kind of boundary, who wants to surpass some kind of barrier. Whether that's a barrier of caste, which is a huge barrier in this country, religion, a barrier that's becoming huger and huger, or gender and sexuality. So also remember that you are not alone because you have other people in your family who are like you. And you are not alone in the country because there are many, many, many people like us who've had to struggle with the same things. So my quick fix response to you will be, become financially independent and get the hell out of there if you need to. Otherwise, try and negotiate that space in which you live, because that space is already queer and your parents just need to be reminded of it. And good luck with that.
Thank you, Professor. I think that's great advice for a lot of your people. If we can we take another last question?
Perhaps quickly. I mean, I love Q&A, but it is already 8 o'clock, so maybe a last.
Right. Okay. Is the right to marriage for same-sex couples a step ahead in the inclusivity of the community, or is it defining the community into confined spaces defined by heterosexuality again?
The reason I'm laughing at that question is not because it's not a good question, it's a very good question, but I actually have very strong feelings about this. And since it's the last question, and I'll keep it very brief, I'm very anti-marriage. I am not anti everyone having the same rights as everybody else. I completely oppose differential treatment under the law. Completely. I think everyone should be equal under the law. I don't think my opposition to marriage comes from the fact is that I don't think that marriage and any kind of right should be coupled together. So right to inheritance, right to property, right to all this stuff should be separated from marriage. Everyone should be given those rights. Marriage should just be its own conservative, silly thing on which you spend money that you don't have. And then we'll see how many people actually want to get married if you actually have all the rights that you need. So no, I am very anti-marriage. I am very anti the current push towards gay marriage or queer marriage, because I feel it does not put pressure on one of the most oppressive institutions that we live in, which is the institution of marriage, as sanctioned by law and bearing the load of so many rights that we think it's the only way forward. We have to be able to think of alternatives. That's what my entire argument has been throughout the session. We have to think alternatively, because if we just go with the mainstream, we lose sight of the fact that people live multiple lives, different lives along different trajectories, and we have to learn to respect those.
Thank you, Professor, for
a
wonderful evening.
And thank you to all the question askers. Those were wonderful questions.
Yes. Thank you for taking the time to support Sangh, and to everybody who has taken time to be with us and ask questions. It's been a wonderful evening. And I request everybody again to visit Sangh's pages and donate and contribute as much as you can. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Anudeep. Thank you, everyone at Sangh, and everybody out there. Please do donate. It's an excellent cause. Okay.
With that, we bring the session to a close.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.